Hello friends, welcome to the Soviet Journey channel. At this station of our journey about the Soviets, I wanted to give detailed information about the historical process of the Kurds living in the Soviet Union, covering all the details. Kurds, who have been living in the Soviet geography, especially in the large regions of the Caucasus, since ancient times, are based on an extremely deep historical structure. In this sense, I wanted to convey this broad subject to you with all its realities. This long documentary, which will last 10 episodes in total, including the introduction and the following 9 episodes, is for both friends who are interested in Kurdish history in general and those who are curious about the historical processes of the Kurds living in the Soviet Union. I predict that all history lovers will benefit from it. Take your tea or coffee and let's witness this historical process together in our long-term, comprehensive documentary. Kurds have had a say in many states established in the Caucasus region over the centuries. The relationship of the Russian Empire, the predecessor state of the Soviet Union, with the Kurds developed in the early 19th century during the Ottoman-Russian Wars and the Russian-Persian Wars. As a result of the agreements signed with the countries in the region, Russia's current borders began to include the Kurds, and many Kurds settled in the Caucasus and Russia, creating a large population. The pressures applied by the Ottomans and Persians at that time also accelerated the migration of Kurds to Transcaucasia. During these periods, many studies were written about the Yazidis and many works of art were created. Starting from the 19th century, depictions of Kurds began to appear in the literature, and research institutes on the language and history of the Kurds began to be established. In contrast, Kurds generally lacked education during the Russian Empire. There were no educational institutions to learn Kurdish, which is the mother tongue. On the other hand, the Kurds living in the region, who were oppressed by the landlords and lords who ruled in the region since the end of the 19th century, were subjected to assimilation during this period. In the 1926 census, it was determined that the Kurds in the region spoke predominantly Tatar language, which was the name given to the Azerbaijani language at that time, not Kurdish. During the October Revolution, Kurdish intellectuals carried out activities to ensure that the Kurdish people living in the entire region supported the Bolsheviks. Ferik Polatbekov and Arab Shamalov can be given as example of this. As a result of the start of the war and the change of Tsarist power in the lands that were under Russian rule before World War I, many new developments occurred. Rebellions emerged, soldiers abandoned their units, and the old administrations were completely changed. There were even attempts to establish new Soviet governments, such as the Erzincan Soviet, and mass murders occurred in response. I published a video containing extensive information about the Erzincan Soviet, which was the first and only Soviet republic established in Anatolia. You can access that documentary from the link on the top right. Due to the mass murders committed against non-Muslim peoples, such as the Armenian and Assyrian massacres that took place during this period, Yazidi Kurds migrated from the areas where they lived to the Caucasus. After the October Revolution, Soviet systems were established in the Caucasus. Kurds were officially recognized as a nation in the constitution after the establishment of the Soviet Union. In 1923, an administrative unit known as Kurdistani Yazdi, centered in Lachin, was established between the Armenian Soviet and the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast for the Kurds living in Azerbaijan. This contributed greatly to the development of Kurdish culture. Kurds began to personally contribute to studies on their own culture, together with researchers from other nations. Between 1928 to 1929, the first Kurdish Latin alphabet, the Shimo Marogulov alphabet, was prepared. Educational institutions and academies were opened, and many Kurdish publishing houses were established. Yerevan Radio's Kurdish broadcasts had a great impact on both Soviet Kurds and all Kurds living beyond the Soviet borders. Zari, the first Kurdish film, was produced in the Armenian Soviet in 1926. In 1937, some Kurdish families and groups living in Armenia and Azerbaijan, and in 1944 in Georgia, were forced to migrate collectively to the Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan Soviets. The reasons for the migration in 1937 were stated by the Soviet authorities as the existence of traditions such as shekhdom, sayyidom, blood ties that had been seen for years in social and economic relations, and the efforts of the rich lords to maintain their administration with patriarchal relations and the destruction of the Caucasus and Sovkhoz systems. The deportations in 1944 were carried out by the Soviet State Defense Committee on the grounds that various groups of people from different nationalities, such as Turks, Kurds and Hemshins, living in rural areas during World War II had provided intelligence about the Soviet Union to Turkey. Except for families that were displaced during the war, Kurds in general displayed significant heroism both on the front and behind the front. For example, Soviet Kurd Saman Siyabendov received the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. During World War II, Iran, another country where Kurds lived heavily, came under the control of the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom. While the war continued, Iranian Kurds formed their own political organizations. The Kurdistan Resurrection Society was founded in this region, which later became the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan. After war ended, the Soviets did not withdraw from the region and continued to support national movements and spread socialist culture. The Mahabad Kurdish Republic was established. The Soviet Union, which did not want a new conflict, under pressure from the USA and Britain and threats of starting a new war, forced all parties to sign a peace agreement in which all parties guaranteed that there would be no military action against Mahabad and withdrew troops from the region. However, the situation did not go as the Soviets wanted. The Iranian administration saw this as an opportunity and, with the support of the USA and the UK, took over the region militarily and ended the sovereignty of the Kurdish Republic of Mahabad. Then Mustafa Barzani, who served as the Minister of War in Mahabad, and his entourage took refuge in the Soviets. Barzani established close ties with the Soviet administrators because he believed that a Kurdish administration in Iraq could only be achieved with Soviet support. After the perestroika policies of the 1980s, the cultural efforts and autonomy demands of the Soviet Kurds became more evident. Soviet Kurds living in all republics united in the organization called Yekban in 1989 and worked to re-establish Kurdistan-e-Yazdi. Work began with the Soviet authorities on the reconstruction of Kurdish autonomy. However, due to historical processes involving many reasons, such as ideological differences, Azerbaijan-Armenia conflicts, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the autonomous region could not be established. According to the census results in 1989, there were 152,717 Kurds living in the Soviet Union. The largest Kurdish population was in the Armenia with 56,127, and the second was in the Georgia with 33,331 people. Yes, friends, in this introduction, we gave a summary of the historical process of the Kurds in the Soviet geography, but we are just beginning this historical process. Now I will explain this historical information in detail. I presented the sections as sections in the video. You can skip to the relevant sections as you wish from the description section of the video. I hope you enjoy this historical narrative that I have prepared in great detail. Here is the detailed historical process of the Soviet Kurds. Kurds have been living in the wide geography of the Caucasus region since ancient times. For example, in the 9th century, the Daisimi dynasty, founded by Kurdish lords, ruled in Burd. The picture you see on the screen is the map showing the Sibyl region in the South Caucasus, drawn by the famous Islamic writer Ibn Havkal in 977. I am presenting the Sibyl region to you on one of the historical maps of that period. In the middle of the map, the lands where Kurds live are highlighted as summer and winter resorts of the Kurds. The Shaddadi dynasty, based in Ganja in the 10th century, also founded by Kurdish tribes, had political, military, and cultural influence in the majority of the South Caucasus. During the Kachin Principality in the 13th century and during the Persian Empire's rule over a large part of the Caucasus between the 16th and 18th centuries, the Kurds always maintained their political and military presence in the region. The work Sharifnama, written in 1597 by the Nakhchivan ruler Sharifkhan Badlisi, contains extensive information about the history of the Kurds and the independent Kurdish states of Mavani, Ayubi, Shahrazar, Great Lord and Little Lor are described. In recent history, the Russia-Iran and Russia-Ottoman wars in the 19th century caused Kurds to move to the South Caucasus in large numbers. Relations between Russia and the Kurds became more comprehensive than in previous periods during the Russian-Ottoman wars in the early 19th century. The Kurds living in the Ottoman and Persian empires had a great power in the region due to the fact that they lived in tribes. The decision-making mechanism of all property and the collection of taxes were in the hands of tribal leaders, and there was no state authority over these leaders. The contacts that started before the Ottoman-Russian War of 1806 to 1812 were one of the factors that determined the future of the region. In the early 19th century, the Russian Empire aimed to ensure the neutrality of the Kurds in the wars against the Persian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. Some Russian historians state that Russian officials of the period made the following statements: "We cannot deal with the Kurds by the method of war. We must find ways to infiltrate Kurdish tribes and Kurdish homes. In order to be able to get in between them, we have to do what we have to do and learn their contradictions, traditions and customs." This is how the Tsarist mind worked. At the beginning of the 19th century, Kurds began to settle in the Transcaucasian region of the Russian Empire. As a result of the Gulistan Treaty signed between Russia and Iran in 1813, the regions of Baku, Karabakh and Shirvan under the control of Iran were included in Russia. As a result of the Nakhchivan and Yerevan regions joining Russia with the Turkmenchi Treaty of 1828, some Kurdish tribes in Yerevan remained within the borders of Russia. During this period, Kurds settled in Russia and Armenia. Similarly, Kurds moved to Russia and Armenia during the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 and the Ottoman-Russian War of 1877 to 1878. During the war, many Kurds in Kars Oblast, which was close to Russia, migrated to the Caucasus region. Many of the academician Kurds in the Soviet Union are from Kars. After the war, with the entry of cities like Ardahan and Kars, where Kurds live, into the borders of Russia, the Kurdish population in Russia reached an even higher rate. In the 1897 census, a total of 99,949 Kurds were recorded, including 53,012 men and 46,937 women. 100,000 Kurds, a large population for that period, lived in Russia. At the end of the 19th century, mass migrations from the Ottoman Empire and Iran to Transcaucasia began due to war, economic reasons and famine. In the 20th century, the migration of Kurds to the Caucasus continued rapidly due to the pressures of the Ottomans and Persians. Between 1917 and 1918, many Yazidi Kurds fled to Armenia and Georgia to escape the massacres, together with the Armenians who remained in the Ottoman Empire. Approximately 12,000 Yazidi Kurds immigrated to Armenia and approximately 3,000 to Georgia. Between 300,000 and 500,000 Yazidi Kurds lost their lives as a result of mass killings during World War I. Before the war, more than 750,000 Yazidi Kurds lived in the Ottoman Empire. However, only around 250,000 Yazidi Kurds survived after the war, and most of the survivors migrated. Apart from the Caucasus, 100,000 Yazidi Kurds migrated to the Shengol Mountains, 12,000 to the Batman and Diyarbakir regions, and 15,000 to the Kamishli region. In 1920, Yazidi Kurds in Armenia began to form their own villages and settled in the evacuated villages. Famous Soviet Kurdish writer and Kurdologist Eskaboyk stated that as a result of the Muslim-Christian conflicts in the Caucasus until 1926, Muslim Kurds settled in the Serhat region, and Yazidi Kurds in Kars and Semeli settled in Armenia. As a result of Russia's conquest of the Caucasus, new ethnic groups began to live in Russia. Among them were many Yazidi Kurds, also known as the Peacock people because of Peacock Angel, one of the main figures in their faith. During this period, it was observed that Russian intellectuals, writers, diplomats and religious officials who visited the region on military and political missions began to mention the Kurds in their travel writings. The first texts about Kurds in Russian publications generally consisted of ethnographic, linguistic, and historical studies. The first Russian text dealing with the Kurds is the work titled Journey to Iran and Asia Minor in 1796, published in the magazine Novosti Puteshestvie in 1809. Similarly, in 1826, an article titled Kurdistan was published in the Seveni Arhiv magazine by Pirimdi Jorbet, who was appointed as an academician to the region. Similarly, the famous Russian poet Alexander Pushkin in his letters and articles, and the painter Grigory Gagarin in his paintings began to focus on the Kurds. During the Ottoman-Russian War of 1828 to 1829, Pushkin, who accompanied the Russian army, encountered the migration of Yazidi Kurds. During Pushkin's journey to Erzurum, he said about the Yazidi Kurds, "There are approximately 300 Yazidi families living at the bottom of Mount Ararat." Pushkin, who learned the details of the Yazidi faith from Hasan Aga, one of the Yazidi leaders in the region, wrote that the alleged devil worship in the Yazidi faith was completely untrue. Pushkin wrote extensively about the Kurds in his work Journey to Erzurum, written in 1829. Painter Gagarin produced the painting Kurdish Tribe Crossing the Aras River in 1849. Kurdish depictions began to appear in ethnographic encyclopedias prepared from the 1860s onwards. Armenian writer Kashada Abovian was the founder of the Kurdish Studies Institute in Russia. Abovian has academically recorded Kurdish culture in Armenia. He stated that the Yazidi faith includes the traditions of the Armenian Apostolic Church and wrote extensive works on the traditions of the Yazidis. Similarly, Joseph Orbelai came to Erzurum and Van in 1911 to 1912 and conducted scientific research. He researched Kurdish culture and carried out historical excavations. The subjects that Orbelai researched, especially by coming to Van's Bahasari, were published under different titles in the future. Orbelai's work, Folklore and Everyday Life in Barzani, was published for the first time in 1982. During the Russian Empire, Kurds were generally uneducated and there were no institutions to receive education in Kurdish. The Tsarist government and then the Musavat Party government established in Azerbaijan did not take any steps to eliminate this situation. The Tsarist administration approached the Kurds as non-Muslims and remained indifferent to this issue. The Musavat government saw it as a priority to use the Kurds for military service through its loyal landlord and Governor-General of Karabakh, Khosrow Bey Sultanov. Kurds who opposed this policy and resisted massively were massacred. Thereupon, many blood feuds began, and an entire family was massacred in exchange for a rich lord being killed. The taxes collected by the Sultanov Beys from Lachen and Hubadli Kurds led to the use of Goturlu Beys and Aga under the auspices of the central Musavat government for more pressure over Kalbahar. All these situations caused the Musavatist lords to approach the Kurds cynically, and the Kurds began to be the subject of jokes and sarcastic nicknames such as Kyuviro and Kuroviro. As a result of many such approaches, the Kurds in the region were assimilated, and decisions were even taken not to speak Kurdish in some Kurdish villages, such as Kiamali. Sultanovs made efforts to make Azerbaijani the dominant language. Since the Azerbaijani language was a language generally understood by people, Kurdish was used only in close communication. As a result of marriages with Turks and Azerbaijanis, nomadic life and contacts established in shopping relations, the use of Kurdish gradually decreased. In the 1926 census, it was determined that the Kurds living in the region mainly spoke Tatar language, which was the name given to the Azerbaijani language at that time. Caucasian Kurds, who traditionally lived a patriarchal tribal life, maintained their social relations within the tent system. These tribes were usually headed by wealthy landowners called Aga or Aksakal, meaning white-bearded lord. Lords were the organizers of the livestock economy, which was necessary for livelihood. This duty arose from the fact that the lord owned the lands consisting of pastures and crops. These lords were exploiting the shepherds and other tribesmen they hired to tend their animal herds and were forcibly collecting taxes from the people. Ownership of land had a hereditary character and was passed from father to son and to other generations. The process of class separation among Soviet Kurds accelerated as the economy gained the power to produce goods for the market and the Kurds adopted a fully settled life. During the founding years of the Soviet Union, the nomadic lifestyle of Kurds was rare. In Lachen, Kalbahar and Kabadli, where Kurds lived densely, Sultanate lords had large lands that were passed down from father to son. Kurds had to work in these lands and were subject to heavy taxes. In most Kurdish villages, working as an agricultural worker to earn a living during the winter months has become a natural way of life. Usury was common within the tribal system. The Muscovite government legalized the rule of these lords and gave their power in this region to the sultanates. Khosrow Bey Sultanov was appointed Governor-General of Karabakh. Before the Sovietization of Azerbaijan, the Göturlu lords who dominated Kelbajar had 80 hectares of plateau and cropland and 45 hectares of forest lands. It is written in the sources that even Hadi Bey Rizroglu, the poorest of these lords, had 105 cows, many sheep, special employees and bodyguards at that time. These lords continued to spread fear among the Kurds for a long time. Especially the sultanates were remembered for their behaviors such as disrupting the peace, raiding, plundering, rape, and mass murder in the pre-Soviet period. The officials of the Russian Empire tried to use these lords who ruled the Kurds for their own policies by giving them money and gifts. Before the Sovietization of the Caucasus, Kurdish settlements were places where tribal relations and class struggle were seen for decades. As a result of the conflicts that broke out on Russian soil during World War I and the change of Tsarist power, many new developments took place. Many rebellions broke out, soldiers abandoned their units, and governments changed. As in the case of the Erzincan Soviet, there were many attempts to establish Soviet governments in local areas, and as a result, mass murders occurred. Although the majority of the Kurdish population in the region left their homes due to the conflicts, socialist activists such as Polat Bekov carried out revolutionary activities in Kars and its surrounding areas. As a result of the massacres committed against non-Muslim peoples, such as the Armenian and Assyrian massacres that took place during this period, Kurds of the Yazidi faith were forced to migrate from their regions. Especially in 1918, many Yazidi Kurds migrated to the Caucasus. While the World War was continuing after the October Revolution in 1917, support for Bolshevism was gaining strength in Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. During the Red Army's entry into Armenia, many Kurds, especially the Kurds living in the Pambakurda village of Alajayaz, led the Red Army. The military unit under the command of Shamil Teymurov played an active role in the establishment of the Soviet government together with the Red Army and enthusiastically welcomed the entry of the 11th Army into Armenia. Soviet Kurdish writer Arab Shamilov described the period in question in his work The Kurdish Shepherd in 1935 as follows: "Only Soviet power has brought happiness, prosperity and progress to the poor Kurds living in the countryside and plains, in the valleys and rocks." During the October Revolution in 1917, the majority of Kurds who lived urban lives in the Caucasus were working as laborers in areas where the working class formed mass power, especially in Baku. Some prominent pro-Tsarist people in the region were trying to prevent all Kurds from participating in the revolution. Some Kurdish lords from the wealthy class were even given the title of general in return for their loyalty to the Tsar. Since these lords owned large lands, they were in a position to dominate other working Kurds. On the other hand, many intellectual socialist Kurds, such as Polat Bekov and Arap Shamilov, carried out public activities to encourage their own people to support the Bolsheviks. The documentary Soviet Kurdistan, shot by the Soviet Union in 1938 and currently on the screen, describes the changing social life of the Kurds living in the Soviet Union following the October Revolution. If you wish, you can watch it from the link at the top right. Thanks to the influence of landowners and their sons on the masses, the traditional tribal system was still strong in the post-revolutionary years, especially among Kurds living in rural areas. While the best lands, pastures and plateaus were in the hands of the lords, the useless ones were left to the poor Kurdish villages. With the establishment of the Soviet system in the region, the disappearance of wealth and the coming to power of Kurdish workers in the region, the privileged position of the lords was destroyed. After Sovietization, new social relations based on socialist principles began to emerge in the villages. The old influence of the lords was broken, and those who committed crimes were arrested. When the new Soviet system came, the lords continued to act together with their sheikhs in the region so as not to appear directly oppressive and exploitative and not to attract the attention of the Soviet forces. Seeing this situation, the Soviet administrators and the Kurds formed powerful organizations to destroy the lordship system. As a result, in 1925, the lords were removed from power, having all their political rights taken away from them. Lords and their accompanying sheikhs and mullahs declared the pro-Soviet Kurds as enemies of their fathers and grandfathers and betrayer of tradition, but the Soviet state did not allow these people to be effective. On the other hand, the research conducted by the Azerbaijan Soviet Scientific Research Institute in the 1930s determined that the privileged positions of lords and rich people still continued in Kurdish villages. The institute stated that in order to break these old social relations, total collectivization policies should be implemented and the village lords should be destroyed as a class. For centuries, Azerbaijanis, Armenians, Georgians, Russians and other peoples in the Caucasus lived together with the Kurds, and no wars occurred between these communities. At the beginning of the 20th century, as a result of the active policies of the rulers of Georgia, Armenia and Azerbaijan in the region, these peoples established their own states and the natural relations between these peoples turned into political relations. The administrations of all three republics faced the situation of governing the Kurds for the first time in history and began to develop different policies. The Azerbaijani government has developed its policies in line with the Kurds being the indigenous people of the country. The Armenian government has been very tolerant towards the Yazidi Kurds, with whom they have lived together for centuries because they were subjected to Ottoman massacres just like them and migrated to the same lands. However, the fact that some Muslim Kurds sided with the Ottomans during the Armenian genocide of 1915 and that the regions where they had lived together for centuries were given entirely to Muslim Kurds was a determining factor in the Armenian government's policies towards the Kurds. The Georgian government has been tolerant towards the Kurds, who came to the region later and are not very numerous within the framework of its general minority policy. In terms of legal status, the Kurds gained unprecedented national and cultural rights. It was officially accepted as a nation by the Soviet Union for the first time. In the 1920s, Kurdish was officially recognized and efforts were made by the state to teach it. Kurdish schools were opened in Georgia in 1921. Education in the mother tongue began to be given in primary schools in Armenia, and a basic education book called Shems in Kurdish was published. The Congress of Yazidi Kurds was held in Armenia in the same year. In 1925, 55 Kurdish schools were opened in Armenia and Azerbaijan. After the establishment of Soviet administrations in the Caucasian countries, national borders began to be determined with the policy of self-determination. With the official decision dated July 21, 1923, the region centered on Lachin, located between Armenia and the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, was given to the Azerbaijani Kurds. Since the term Kurdistan was used in books and fairy tales written in Russia in the second half of the 19th century, this region was officially named Kurdistan by the Bolsheviks in 1921. The region was established in July 1923 upon the proposal of the first secretary of the Azerbaijan Communist Party, Sergei Kirov, and the approval of Vladimir Lenin. Used in the Soviet Union is the name given to small local governments with sub-administrative units. Author Smail Bashikchi, known for his work on Kurdish history, stated that this administration was born in an environment where there were fragile balances among the Caucasian peoples. He also states that this region was established thanks to the Azerbaijani rulers, who aimed to reduce the dominance of the Armenians in the region by making an alliance with the Kurds. On the other hand, it is stated that this decision stems from Armenia's desire to establish a buffer zone consisting of Kurds on its border in order to prevent tensions that may arise after the transfer of Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijan, and the desire to help overcome historical disagreements. Azerbaijani Bolshevik Husi Gajiyev was appointed as the head of the USD administration. Although this decision was not welcomed by the Armenian government, it is stated that the fact that Azerbaijan's influence in the region has decreased somewhat together with the Kurds in Nagorno-Karabakh has made the Armenian administrators happy. According to the 1926 census, 72% of the region's population was Kurdish and its number was 41,193. During this period, many new villages were built for the nomadic Kurds. However, with the decision taken at the 6th Azerbaijan All-Soviet Congress held on April 9, 1929, the political existence of the Kurdistani Yezdi administration was terminated. In its place, a new administration called Kurdistan Okrug was established in 1930. Kurdologist Gazar Shemilovich states that the reasons for this decision include the nationalist policies of the Azerbaijani government and the policies of the Turkish government against the establishment of a region called Kurdistan. It can be seen that the opposition of the Turkish administrators increased even more after the suppression of the Sheikh Said rebellion. Issues regarding Kurdish autonomy were frequently brought up in negotiations and agreements between the Soviet Union and Turkey. Russian diplomat Neymark, who was working in Yerevan, sent an official report on this issue to the Russian Soviet People's Commissariat of Foreign Affairs on September 5, 1935. He reported that the publication of the Kurdish Riyetezi newspaper and the Turkish KZL Kurdistan newspaper published in Yerevan was perceived as a threat by Tirakai and that the Turkish government had turned its attention to the autonomous regions of the Kurds. The first attempt to mass migrate some Kurdish families within the scope of population migration was made based on the decision of the Council of People's Commissars dated December 17, 1936 and number 2023-20. The practical implementation of this official decision began on July 17, 1937. In addition, an additional decision was issued on November 8, 1937, and it was decided that some previously determined Kurdish families would be subject to exile. The decision is as follows. Based on the government's decision, approximately 2,100 people from 425 Kurdish households will be evacuated from the Armenian border regions in the coming days. The new settlement will be Kyrgyzstan. The forced migration of many families from different nations living in the Caucasus and other regions in the 1930s was explained by the class war thesis. Soviet officials stated that many situations, such as the continuation of the landowner system, sabotage of collective farms, the continuation of exploitation of the rich through traditions such as sheikhdom and blood feuds had been reported many times since the late 1920s. The following statements were included in the decision of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks dated June 23, 1929 on the situation of the Azerbaijani party organizations. The village lord system, which exploits the tribal and religious backwardness of the Kurds, is still in a strong position, but the practical struggle against it has so far been quite weak. Although the struggle against slavery and the defense of the interests of the poor are pressing tasks, these problems have not been given sufficient attention in the multinational region. In the politics of the period, it is seen that migration policies were implemented in many regions where these relations had continued for years. Similar population migrations have occurred in many groups in the republics of Central Asia, where such traditions have been observed for many years. In November 1937, the number of Kurds subjected to forced migration to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan was 1,325. According to an official document dated November 9, 1938, 1,121 Kurdish and Armenian families migrated from the Caucasus to Kazakhstan in the autumn of 1937. In the 1939 census, it was determined that the Kurdish population living in Kazakhstan was 2,387, in Kyrgyzstan 1,490, and in Uzbekistan 156. Famous Soviet Kurdish historian Nadia Nadirov stated that only the Kurds in Nakhchivan were deported in 1937. The official reasons for deporting people included being anti-Soviet. Exile was evaluated within the scope of the struggle against religious traditions such as sheikhdom and lordship status, especially among Kurds living in rural areas. In the social and economic relations of the Soviet Kurds, patriarchal relations from the pre-Soviet period continued, and the landlords who had lost their former positions still created fear among the Kurds. Kurdish writer Kemal Berki states that the large Kurdish population was not deported at that time, the Yazidi Kurds were not deported, and that this was especially applied to some Kurdish groups living in Azerbaijan and bullying the people. Mahmouda Miho, who witnessed that period, said the following about the reasons for the migration. "We were living with our animals in Nakhchivan until 1937. I was 14 years old at that time. Azerbaijanis were complaining about us. They said, Kurds are against socialism. They do not accept Caucasus and Sovkhozes. They cross the border and go back and forth to their relatives in IDR. They carry information there. Many people were arrested because of the complaints." Similarly, writer and Kurdologist Gazar Shamilovich described the events regarding the displaced Kurds with the following expressions. Kurds living on both sides of the Aras River have engaged in several small-scale clashes with border security forces while violating the loose borders to visit family. For example, the clash between a person named Basoy Osman and Soviet border guards while crossing the border with his companions in 1937, and the deaths of several people, was reflected in intelligence reports and was discussed in the public. He also stated that during the collectivization period, some rich Kurds did not want to surrender their animals, that there were many clashes between those who wanted to cross into Turkey and the border guards, and that this created the percept that Kurds who had relatives in Turkey were unreliable. The second mass Kurdish deportation took place during the years when Nazi Germany was trying to occupy and control the territory of the Soviet Union, and the war continued. The espionage activities carried out by Turkey, which had relations with Nazi Germany during the war, through the Meskhetian Turks and Azeris living in Georgia, caused serious concern among Soviet administrators. Thereupon, in the decision numbered 6279 of the Soviet State Defense Committee dated July 31, 1944, it was instructed that Turks, Kurds and Hemshins would be deported from the border regions of Georgia. In his reasoned report dated November 28, 1944, Soviet People's Commissar of Internal Affairs Lavrenti Beria included statements about the exiled people, such as that they were involved in smuggling, providing intelligence to Turkey, and helping bandits. According to official documents, on November 15, 1944, a total of 26,591 people of 3 different nationalities were deported to the eastern regions of the Soviet Union. In the next 10 days, a total of 91,095 people were displaced from Georgia. The train carrying the remaining 695 families left Tbilisi for Uzbekistan on January 31, 1945. In this migration event, the total number of people, mostly Turks and Hemshin, is 94,995 people. 8,694 of them are Kurds. Soviet Kurdish writer Esker Boyk states that the migration was not an exile targeting all Kurds, that Kurds had already been living in the migration regions for a long time, that Muslim Kurds had been there for many years, and that Yazidi Kurds settled in the region later. For example, he stated that during the Russian-Iranian War of 1826, Hessani, one of the large Yazidi tribes led by Hasan Aga, fought on the Russian side against Iran because they were subjected to religious oppression by Muslims, and that Russian historians praised the Kurdish troops. Starting in 1956, during the Khrushchev era, the Kurds who were subjected to migration began to return to their former lands. On April 18, 1956, an official decree was issued to lift restrictions on the return of the deported Crimean Tatars, Balkars, Meskhetian Turks, Kurds and Hemshins. In the archives of the People's Commissariat of Defense, it is written that Soviet Kurds participated in the Great Patriotic War and showed great service by defending their homeland against the Nazis. During the war, most of the Kurds lived in rural areas and most of them worked in Caucasus. Soviet Kurds generally supported the Red Army on the front or behind the lines. For example, The decision taken by the Caucasus members working in the Kurdish villages of the Caravanserai and Alajais regions after the meeting they held in 1941 was as follows. We, together with our glorious Red Army, will defend our homeland, which has given us freedom and happiness until the last drop of our blood. We will unite more closely around Lenin's party for the crushing of fascism. Similarly, the collective farm workers of Minkend village in Lachen announced that they would support the Red Army after the rally they organized. During the years of the war, many Kurds were accepted into the Communist Party. As can be seen from official data, there were 31 Soviet Kurds in 1943, 46 in 1944, and 30 in the first half of 1945. There were many Kurds who joined the Soviet partisans. Soviet Kurd Saman Siabendov was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union on October 1, 1941. Soviet Kurd Ali Abdulrahman, who fought against the Nazis in Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine and Belarus, was awarded a total of 4 high-ranking medals: the First-Class Partisan Medal, the Victory Medal, the Medal for the Defense of Moscow and the Medal for the Defense of the Caucasus. Many Kurdish officers took part in the historically important defense of Leningrad. By the way, speaking of Leningrad, do not forget to watch our video of Shostakovich's 7th Symphony, in which I explain the live symphony concert held during the defense of Leningrad, an unprecedented city defense. You can access it from the link above right. Similarly, during the siege of Sevastopol, Akhmedov, an Azerbaijani Kurdish sniper, killed a total of 17 Nazi soldiers in 1941, while Navrozov, also an Azerbaijani Kurd, killed a total of 80 Nazi soldiers in 1942. Many Kurds in Armenia and Azerbaijan, such as Aloyan, Asadov, Shamilzade and Akhmedov, who fought decisively against the Nazis in the Battle of Stalingrad, defended their homelands against the Nazis. Soviet Kurd Karasova, who was in the ranks of Ukrainian partisans, was declared a hero of the Soviet Union and was awarded the Partisan Medal First Class. Armenia's Yamatov and Azerbaijan's Chernov were at the forefront of the fight against the Nazis in Hungary. Some Soviet Kurds even participated in the war against the Japanese Empire between August and September 1945. Kurdish Major Ayev was second in command of a motorized artillery regiment in Manchuria during this time. Marshal of the Soviet Union Ivan Bagramyan made the following statements regarding the participation of Soviet Kurds in the war. During the years of the Great Patriotic War, when their country, where they had achieved national freedom and happiness for the first time in its history, was in danger of extinction, the Kurds, like other brother nations, showed themselves as ardent Soviet patriots. All the Kurds I met after fighting together at the front, like all Soviet fighters, fulfilled their military duty with dignity and honor. World-famous Kurdish writer Sigurdsson wrote the lines you see on the following screen in his poem supporting the Red Army, which he wrote in Rouhani magazine in 1943, when the war was still going on. The line ends with, "Do not be afraid, your great supporter is the Red Army." Although the Nazis treated Soviet citizens with utmost brutality, all nations heroically defended their homeland. We also have a video explaining the atrocities committed by the Nazis throughout the war. You can watch it from the link above right. The Soviet Union's relations with Kurds in other countries and their reflections on the diplomatic field became possible after the establishment of the Mahabad Kurdish Republic after World War II and Mustafa Barzani's asylum in the Soviet Union. The Red Army's entry into northern Iran in August 1941, its support for the establishment of Mahabad, and Cold War conflicts formed the background to the Soviet Union's relations with Kurds in other countries. In 1941, during World War II, the Soviet Union and its ally Britain were trying to secure the Iranian front. Iranian leader Reza Pahlavi, who was close to the Axis powers, was overthrown and replaced by his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Iran remained under the control of the British Army and the Red Army throughout the war. In order to prevent threats from this region, the Soviet Union established control in the north of the country, while England established control in the south. Reza Shah, who was the ruler of Iran at the time the war began after the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union, was in close economic and political cooperation with Nazi Germany. When the Soviets entered the war, the Iranian border began to be used as an attack or operation area against the Soviet Union. When the warnings were not taken into account by Iran, Red Army units entered the northern regions of Iran on August 25, 1941, based on Article 6 of the Soviet-Iranian Treaty of 1921. Article 6 of this agreement authorized the Russian government to send troops to Iran to eliminate the threat if Iranian territory was used for aggression against the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. While the war continued, Kurds established many political organizations in the countries they lived in. The Kurdistan Revival Community was founded in Iran, which later became the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan. In December 1941, for the first time, a Kurdish delegation from Iran was invited to Baku, and representatives of Iranian Kurds held meetings with the General Secretary of the Azerbaijan Communist Party, Mir Jafar Bagirov. This first visit was an introductory visit due to the lack of an organization of the Iranian Kurds and their lack of a political goal. It was stated in the talks that the Soviet Union would support the establishment of a Kurdish government in Iran. In the second meeting held in Baku in 1945, after the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan was established and Qadi Mohammed was elected as the General Secretary of the party, Bagirov declared that they supported the struggle of Iranian Kurds for autonomy. As a result of the talks between the Kurds and Azerbaijanis in Iran, a friendship agreement was signed on April 23, 1946 between the Azerbaijan National Government and the Mahabad Kurdish Republic. Kurdish leader Mustafa Barzani, who moved from Iraq to Iran, sent a letter to the Soviet government about the problems experienced by the Kurds on January 1, 1945. In the letter he signed under the name Commander of Revolution and Freedom of the Kurds in Iraq and your friend, Barzani said, in his letter, which he started by praising the Red Army for its struggle for the liberation of humanity, equality and freedom. He touched upon the situation of the Kurds and announced that they were ready to live as a free republic under the support of the Soviet Union and to develop political, commercial, cultural and military relations. Barzani's name was mentioned for the first time in Soviet documents in the minutes of a meeting held in January 1946 regarding the 1943 Barzani uprising. In this report, Mustafa Barzani was stated as the brother of Barzani tribe leader Hmmed Barzani and the second important name of the tribe. Unlike his brother and other Barzani sheikhs, he is educated, cultured, nationalist and progressive. Statements were included. It is also written in the minutes that Barzani was reacting to the United Kingdom, which backed down from its promise of autonomy to the Kurds, and that the United Kingdom worked to suppress the uprising by spreading rumours that Barzani was pro-Bolshevism, and that after the defeat of the uprising, he moved to Iran. Barzani, who supported the Mahabad Kurdish Republic, joined the resistance ranks against Iranian troops and became the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the new republic. When the war ended, the Soviets refused to withdraw troops and continued to support national movements and spread socialism. For this purpose, the Mahabad Kurdish Republic was established. Qadi Mohammed was elected president, and Iraqi Kurdish leader Mustafa Barzani served as Minister of War. Barzani founded the Kurdistan Democratic Party with the aim of strengthening the unity of Iraqi and Iranian Kurds. Despite these developments, the life of the Mahabad Kurdish Republic was short. On January 9, 1942, an agreement was signed between the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union and Iran, determining the duration of stay of Soviet and British military units in Iran and their withdrawal after the war. While talks were taking place about the withdrawal of Soviet troops, Iran complained about the Soviet Union to the United Nations in March 1946. The United Kingdom and the United States also delivered diplomatic notes to the USSR. An agreement was signed between the Soviet Union and Iran on April 4, 1946. According to the agreement, Soviet troops would withdraw from Iran within a month and a half, and Iran's internal problems would be resolved peacefully, not militarily. As a result, Soviet military units completely withdrew from Iran on May 9, 1946. However, the Iranian army, with the support it received from the West, violated the agreement and entered Tabriz on December 12, then Mahabad on December 17, ending the sovereignty of the Azerbaijani national government and the Kurdish Republic of Mahabad. The agreement between the Soviets and Iran, which stipulated the establishment of a joint oil company, was cancelled by Iran under the pressure of the United Kingdom and the USA. After the Iranian army dominated the region, many Kurdish commanders surrendered, but Mustafa Barzani and his entourage refused to surrender. When Iranian forces began preparations to attack Barzani's supporters, Barzani and the 506 warriors in his team began to advance towards the Iris River. Thereupon, Iranian forces followed Barzani and his entourage. After a journey that lasted 41 days, they crossed north along the Iris River and were then allowed to enter through the Soviet border and settled in Soviet Transcaucasia. Barzani and his team, who initially lived in the Azerbaijan Soviet, were sent to Tashkent, the capital of the Uzbekistan, after they had a disagreement with the president Mirziyoyev Bagirov. Later, the group dispersed to other parts of the Soviet Union. In the letter he sent to Molotov in June 1949, Barzani requested to come to Moscow to discuss the Kurdish issue. He came to Moscow at the end of 1953 and enrolled in the Higher Party School, where he studied until 1958. During the Cold War, Barzani established close ties with Soviet Union because he believed that an independent Kurdistan in Iraq could only be established with Soviet support. Barzani met with Nikita Khrushchev, who stated that he was impressed by the Kurdish leader. While the countries participating in the Cento alliance initially had a hostile attitude towards the Soviet Union, relations softened shortly after the collapse of the monarchy in Iraq in July 1958. On September 10, 1958, the Iraqi government issued a special amnesty for those who participated in the Kurdish national movement in Iraq, especially Mustafa Barzani. Thereupon, the Barzani first went to Prague and then returned to Iraq via Cairo on October 6. The remaining Peshmerga members and their families were dispersed to various parts of the Soviet Union. 456 Kurdish men, 141 Soviet and Kurdish women, and 254 children participated in the return. They entered the Persian Gulf on April 16, 1959. The rapprochement between the Soviet Union and the Kurds in other countries created new opportunities for Soviet Kurds in their relations with Kurds abroad. Kurdish students from Iraq received education in institutions in Yerevan. Barzani supported the Abdul Karim Qasim administration in Iraq and tried to benefit from it for their own policies. Kurdistan Democratic Party became the second most populous party in Iraq after the Iraqi Communist Party. The party aimed to achieve autonomy within the borders of Iraq, but Abdul Karim Qasim opposed this demand. Similarly, it became a natural rival of the Iraqi Communist Party. Barzani relations with both the Abdul Karim Qasim and the Communists deteriorated. After Barzani went to Moscow to attend the October Revolution Day celebrations in 1960, he met with Khrushchev and many Soviet officials and stated that the situation in Iraq was deteriorating. After the overthrow and execution of Abdul Karim Qasim by the Ba'ath Party on February 8, 1963, the Kurds came under even more pressure. The Ba'ath Party was virtually ignoring the Kurds. Thereupon, demonstrations were organized in the big cities of the Eastern Bloc countries with the participation of Kurdish students. Protests were held in Prague and East Berlin in February 1963, and official declarations were issued. Official newspapers and institutions throughout the Eastern Bloc countries announced that they supported the struggles of Iraqi Kurds. Soviet diplomacy increased its pressure on the Cento member governments of Turkey and Iran, which it accused of putting pressure on the Kurds. In June 1963, the Baathists launched military operations against Kurdish regions. The Soviet Union called for an immediate cessation of these operations and made official overtures to the United Nations Security Council to halt these actions. The Soviet Foreign Ministry sent a stern note to the consulates of Iraq, Turkey, Iran and Syria, warning them that other countries should not intervene in Iraq. In 1966, Soviet officials, including the future Russian Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov, personally visited Barzani. Caucasian Kurdish students sent a petition to the Central Committee of Georgia and the Transcaucasian Bureau of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, asking for the right to organize open demonstrations in Tbilisi in support of Iraqi Kurds. Events in Iraq led to the establishment of the Kurdish Student Council in Armenia by students, including Kerem Ankes, and this council acted together with the Komsomol until the early 1970s. In March 1970, an agreement was signed between the Ba'ath administration and Barzani with the open support of Soviet diplomacy. Both parties declared that they adopted the Soviet autonomy policy, and it was emphasized that the multinational Iraq structure should be preserved and Kurdish organizations were established. Soviet representatives, led by Primakov, tried to reconcile the Iraqi central government with the Kurds on issues such as autonomy for the Iraqi Kurds, the right to elect their own leaders, participation in the government, and giving the vice presidential seat to a Kurdish representative. Perestroika policies that emerged in the 1980s led to an acceleration of historical research on the national question among Soviet Kurds and the emergence of more radical discussions. During this period, Soviet Kurdish activists began to attract more attention to the Kurdish issue outside the Soviet Union. In March 1989, a meeting was held in Kazakhstan under the leadership of Mehmet Babayev and his comrade Mustafayev. At this meeting, the aims and objectives of the new Soviet Kurdish Union to be established under the name YEK, meaning unity, were determined, and the details of the rally to be held for this purpose were discussed. On May 21, 1989, YEKBUN was established together with delegates from 9 Soviet republics. In its program, it accepted principles such as uniting Kurdish organizations in order to prevent assimilation, continuing the efforts to rebuild the Kurdistan Uyezdi, the abolished Kurdish autonomous region, and making the necessary suggestions and recommendations to the Soviet Union Parliament for all these. Learning that the Soviet Parliament Congress would be held 4 days later, on May 25, some Soviet Kurdish activists led by Mehmet Babayev demonstrated in Pushkin Square in Moscow before the Congress. However, if the aim of building Kurdish autonomy could not be achieved, negotiations were held for another region where Kurds coexisted in any region in the Soviet Union. Permission to publish the magazine was obtained in all republics, and on September 19, 1991, the newspaper Kurdistan began to be published in Kazakhstan. While Shakro Migoy, head of the Kurdology department of the Armenian Orientalism Institute, was describing the progressive world of Kurdish militancy, he frequently criticized the policies implemented by the Soviet administrators towards the Kurds. In the 1990s, conflicts increased in Iraqi, massacres of Kurds occurred in Iraq during the Saddam Hussein era, and tensions between Armenians and Azerbaijanis in the Nagorno-Karabakh region led to increased violence against Kurds in both republics. These conditions led Soviet Kurdish activists to unite around the idea of transforming the Kurdish issue from an internal problem into a national one. This situation was clearly emphasized at the conference in July 1990, which also included Kurdish activists and intellectuals from outside the Soviet Union. During this period, many letters were sent to the Soviet authorities criticizing their indifference to the Kurds in the Middle East. Between 1989 and 1990, Kurds from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Central Asia and Transcaucasia migrated intensively to Rostov Oblast, the Digia Republic, Krasnodar and Stavropol. At the General Meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on September 20, 1989, the Kurdish issue was put on the agenda. An international conference named Kurds of the USSR, History and Present Facts was held on 25-26 September 1990 by the decision of the Central Committee. Kurdish representatives from Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Germany and France also attended the conference. Speaking at the conference, Mehmet Babayev stated that they were insistent on the autonomous region and made the following statements on the subject. If our conference does not demand the restoration of Kurdish autonomy from the presidency of the Soviet Union and the Soviet government, our speeches here will be in vain. If we cannot achieve autonomy after all the problems and events we have experienced, we will face complete extinction in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, people who do not have autonomy are not considered to be members of the public. Some comrades state the following: schools should be opened, newspapers should be published in the various regions where we live. This is not in our economic interest, nor the benefit of the state. There are no more than 300 Kurdish families in any province. Will a school be established, or a newspaper printed for every 100 families? We know that a newspaper printed in Yerevan in 10 days. As a result of Yekban's persistent attempts, the Soviet authorities promised to establish a state commission on the reconstruction of Kurdish autonomy. The Special Commission, consisting of 8 parliamentarians and 4 Kurdish representatives, chaired by Soviet Deputy Vitaly Sobolev, was convened on November 20, 1990. The Commission undertook the task of uncovering the facts about Kurdish autonomy and conducting research based on official documents to determine whether the Kurds needed an autonomous republic. In May 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev's deputy, Ravenkov, made the following statement regarding his positive views on the establishment of the Kurdish autonomous region. Comrade Gorbachev sends his greetings to you. He appreciates your work towards the reconstruction of the Kurdistan autonomous region. I can already give you the good news that Red Kurdistan will be established. We hope to declare autonomy in a few months. This issue is also discussed with the Azerbaijani administration. Make good use of state television and the Soviet press to create public opinion. Prepare and mobilize your compatriots living in different republics. During this period, Yekin was divided into 2 groups, autonomists and culturalists. While autonomists argued that the only solution was autonomy, culturalists stated that cultural autonomy was necessary. These sharp differences of opinion also affected the struggle. Rafik Nishanov, an official of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union, told the Yekin delegation, "First of all, do not come to me without clarifying your views on the revival of Red Kurdistan, otherwise we cannot solve the problem." Despite all these developments, the Kurdish autonomous region could not be established as a result of the lack of intellectual unity among the Yekin representatives, the region being in a place where Azerbaijan-Armenia conflicts were intensified and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The group called the Caucasus Kurdistan Freedom Movement, founded in 1992 under the leadership of Vekil Mustafayev, declared the establishment of Red Kurdistan with the support of Russia and Armenia, but it was not successful. Mustafayev said the following about the period in 2014. When Azerbaijan left the Soviet Union in 1991 and declared its independence, its parliament announced that they were Turks, their language was Turkish, and their lands belonged to Turkey. When Russia and Armenia were disturbed by this situation, they asked us to declare Red Kurdistan and stated that they would provide all necessary support, even weapons. Russia had to develop friendly relations with the Kurds once again for their own interests. For its own security, Russia preferred to be a neighbor to Red Kurdistan rather than to Azerbaijan and Turkey. Armenia also needed Caucasian Kurdistan for connections with Russia. When we declared Red Kurdistan in 1992, Lachen became the capital. The cities of Kelbisa, Kadebli and Jobrayil were also within the borders of the state. 2 months later, I went to Moscow at the request of Russia. We held a meeting with the authority of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs about the possible aid in our relations. Kurdish representatives from Armenia and Azerbaijan gathered at the Lenin Mausoleum in Moscow to protest the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Kurds were dispersed among the newly independent Eurasian states and the Commonwealth of Independent States countries. In Russia, Kurds are mostly concentrated in the Krasnodar Krai and the North Caucasus. Most of the Kurds who migrated to Georgia for economic reasons live in Tbilisi. Due to national problems between Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, many Kurds living in these countries had to emigrate. Some Azerbaijani Kurds attempted to establish the Lachen Kurdish Republic during the period of the dissolution of the Soviets, but these attempts were unsuccessful. During the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Armenian-Kurdish relations became tense. Armenian nationalists almost daily remind us that the Kurds played a role alongside the Ottoman administrators in the 1915 Armenian massacres, and their propaganda to this effect led to the process of exodus of the Kurds. In May 1991, Armenian troops entered Lachen, where Kurds lived heavily, and took control of the city. The city was declared an Old Armenian city and its name was changed to Kashadeg, and approximately 15,000 Kurdish population were expelled from the city. Similarly, in April 1993, Armenian troops captured Karl-Bahar and forced the Kurds living there to migrate. The cohabitation of Kurds with Azerbaijanis led to the forced migration of Kurds and Azerbaijanis by Armenian nationalists. While the Kurds in provinces such as Masis, Ardashat and Ararat were forced to migrate, Yazidi Kurds in Ekmedzan, Ardaskak, Aparan and Oktyabr provinces were not subjected to migration. More than 20,000 Kurds living in Armenia were deported to former Soviet countries on the grounds that their ancestors caused the 1915 Armenian massacres. During this period, attempts were made to prevent the Kurds from supporting the Azerbaijanis in conflicts. A leaflet titled "A Call to the Kurdish People" signed Suraniva's Yarn, Communist Party member, May 11, 1989, was distributed everywhere. The text said, "Armenians and Kurds come from the same historical roots. We are peoples belonging to the Indo-European language family, and our culture is common. There are no Kurdish schools, classrooms, newspapers, and theatres in Azerbaijan. The Kurdish people are ignored. However, in Armenia, Kurds have national schools, newspapers, theatres, and various music groups. The works of Kurdish writers and scientists are published. Kurdish research departments operate at the Yerevan University. Our Kurdish brothers, appeal to the parliament of the Soviet Union and make efforts to regain your rights that were violated in Azerbaijan. Work to build Kurdish autonomy in Karl-Bahar and Lachen. Fight to prevent the honourable name of the Kurds in Azerbaijan from being consigned to history." However, this call turned into a policy of forced migration of Kurds from the entire region in the following years. The majority of the Kurds who were forcibly displaced due to the conflicts were settled in the city of Krasnodar in Russia on the initiative of the chairman of the Soviet Security Council, Yevgeny Primakov, who has been in close contact with the world's Kurds for many years. The Kurdish Organizations of the Commonwealth of Independent States was established in 1994. Later, the Kurdish organizations in these countries were united under a single confederation. There are still high proportions of Kurdish populations in former Soviet countries. According to the 2010 census, the Kurdish population in Russia is 63,818. According to the 2011 census in Armenia, there are 37,470 Kurds living in the country and 35,270. Two of this number are Yazidis. According to the 2014 census in Georgia, there are 13,770 Kurds living in the country. In 2009, the Kurdish population in Azerbaijan was 6,100. The Kurdish population was 5,561 in Kazakhstan in 2009, 13,171 Kurds in Kyrgyzstan, 6,097 in Turkmenistan in 1995, and 1,839 in Uzbekistan in 1989. In 1926, the number of Kurds living in the Soviet Union was determined as 54,661. In 1989, this number was 152,717. In other words, the population of Kurds increased approximately threefold. In 1926, the largest Kurdish population was in the Azerbaijan with 41,193, and in the census of 1939 and subsequent years, it was stated that the largest number of Kurds lived in the Armenia and secondly in the Georgia. In the list you see on the screen, you see the Kurdish population in the Russian Empire and the Soviet republics by year. After the Kurds settled in the Caucasus in the 19th century, importance was given to researching Kurdish history, learning Kurdish, and translating Kurdish works among the intellectuals living in the Russian Empire. These studies were generally carried out by groups such as scientists, diplomats, and artists. On the other hand, Kurdish culture was generally suppressed in the eyes of the public. There were no institutions where Kurds could receive education to learn their native language, Kurdish. The Tsarist regime and the Musavat Party government established in Azerbaijan did not take any steps to eliminate this situation. The Musavat government exerted cultural pressure on the Kurds through the loyal landowner and Karabakh governor General Khosrow Bey Sultanov. The Sultanovs made special efforts to make Azerbaijani the dominant language among the Kurds. Since the general language of the people living in the region at that time was Azerbaijani, Kurdish had to be used only for communication in the immediate vicinity. As a result of marriages with Azerbaijanis, nomadic life and contacts established in shopping relations, the use of Kurdish gradually decreased. In fact, in the 1926 census, it was determined that the Kurds in the region predominantly spoke Tatar, that is, Azerbaijani, and the number of people speaking Kurdish was only 3,123. The establishment of the Soviet Union played a historical role in the development of Kurdish culture. For the first time, Kurds began to contribute to Kurdology studies alongside non-Kurdish researchers. While Kurds in Turkey, Syria, Iraq and Iran faced restrictions on their opportunities to develop their culture along with their native language, Kurds living in the Soviet Union turned their native language into an academic discipline. On the way to mass literacy, Kurds in the Soviet of Armenia learned and enriched their language in all three Armenian alphabets, namely Armenian, Latin and Cyrillic. Then they would make their own alphabet. The first Kurdish teacher and the first editor of the Soviet Kurdistan newspaper was Bayram Mammadov. In 1921, Kurdish schools were opened in the Georgian Soviet and the Yazidi Kurds Congress was held in the same year. In 1925, 55 Kurdish education schools were opened in the Armenian and Azerbaijan. The first Caucasus Kurds conference in Armenia was held in 1925, and the second conference was held in 1926. There were 27 Kurdish education schools in the Armenian in the 1931-32 academic year. 70 books in Kurdish were published in the Armenian between 1929 and 37. More than 30 Kurdish books were published in the Azerbaijan between 1930 and 38. In 1931, the Kurdish Teachers' School was opened, and in 1932, the Kurdish faculty was opened. The first Latin alphabet of Kurdish, the Shemo Marogulov alphabet, was prepared between 1928 and 29. Many Kurdish publishing houses were established and many works, including children's books, began to be published. Riya Tezi, which was the first Kurdish newspaper published in the Latin alphabet in March 1930 and continues to be published today, is an example of these publications. After Riya Tezi, the bi-weekly Kurdish newspaper Bodin was launched. In 1931, the Transcaucasian Education Academy was opened in Yerevan to train teachers of Kurdish language and literature. The 1934 Kurdology Congress, which was held for the first time in terms of its subject and scope, was held in the Armenia. The Kurdish Shepherd, the first Kurdish novel written by Shemo, was published in Yerevan in 1935 and made a big impact. In 1934, the book titled Women's Liberation, which was about women's education, was about the development of Kurdish women. Also in 1934, the first Kurdish theatre book, consisting of a 3-act play about the cultural production of Soviet Kurds, was published. Nato Mahmudov, Hovsep Orbalai, Eli Abdulrahman, Mroy Yest, Hesi Cind, Tozin Reed, Kasim Sel, Emin Evdal, Kanadi Kurdo, FRKSIV, Sisika Simo, Ezva Red, Eskaboik, Zelan, Erkiz Ray, Karlan An, Ferdasua. Many Soviet artists, writers and academics such as Emirk Serdar, Abulkasim Lath, Kamil Bedahan and EGTX Studio carried out many works for the development of Kurdology and Kurdish culture. The Kurdish Marxist writer Chigahuan had a significant impact on the Soviet Kurds and the world. The first Kurdish film, Zar, released in 1926, was produced by Armanfilm, the film studio in the Armenia. Directed by Hamo Beknazarian, the film is about the love of Zar, a young Kurdish girl, for the shepherd Saido before the October Revolution. The film is among the classics of Kurdish cinema and is still referenced today. In 1938, the documentary Soviet Kurdistan was released, which was about the changing social life of the Kurds living in the Soviet Union with the October Revolution. Gayan, one of the best-known ballets by Soviet Armenian composer Erem Khachaturian, contains Kurdish characters and themes. The original libretto is an ethnic love story involving Armenians, Kurds and Russians, set against the backdrop of a Caucasus in the mountainous area of the Soviet-Turkish border with Armenia. The ballet is best known for its fiery sword dance, which Khachaturian called the Dance of the Kurds. Yerevan Radio's Kurdish broadcast began in 1955 and had a great impact on Kurds beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. Ezva Resht is the first announcer of the radio. Kurds in neighboring countries, especially along the Turkish border, had direct access to Soviet broadcasts and listened to their own language, which had been banned for years. The publications were very important in raising awareness of Kurdish ethnic identity, and the Soviets' discourses on national consciousness and socialism resonated strongly among many Kurdish groups. The head of Yerevan Radio's Kurdish department was the Soviet Kurdish intellectual Kasim Sel. Sel's children also became followers of this cultural cause. In this sense, the Sel family became the fundamental part of the Kurdish cultural movement in the Armenian Soviet. The family's intense contact with Kurds in all regions of the Soviet Union, especially those living in Central Asia, continued. Yes, comrades, in this long documentary, I gave you information about the historical processes of the Kurds living in the Soviet Union. I hope you liked this information and received a like from you for the video. If you have any topics you would like to add, let's discuss them together. I publish many videos about the Soviets and world socialist movements. You can access all our documentaries from the video description section on our channel. Please do not forget to subscribe to our Soviet Journey channel to follow us. Goodbye for now. Stay in solidarity.